누가 감히 이런 짓을 해? 당장 찾아내서 죽여버려!
Are you telling me they hit our main warehouse? I told you to secure that location!
The midnight phone call took barely 30 seconds. 30 seconds that turned the cold glass of the skyscraper into a mirror of hell, silenced the digital hum of a multi-billion-dollar empire, and transformed a silent city night into a conflagration that could never be extinguished. Jang Tae-hyuk felt the shift in his marrow. The air on the high-rise balcony grew thin and searing, as if the very atmosphere was retreating from the betrayal now screaming through the receiver. He had barely pressed the end call button before his world began to liquefy into ash. He stood there, a sharply dressed titan in a navy business suit, his white collar crisp but his composure a shattered ruin. He was a man who had spent decades overlooking the city from a position of absolute status, believing his distance was his safety. But the man on the balcony didn't look like a king anymore. He clutched his smartphone with a white-knuckled desperation, his mouth open in a silent shout of panic, his brows furrowed in the intense, alarmed realization of a god who had just discovered he was mortal. Behind him, the modern skyline he thought he owned began to vomit thick black smoke, the bright sunlight mocking the large-scale chaos of explosions rippling through his infrastructure. His presence had once been a monolith of iron and order, shoulders squared like a fortress, a posture that commanded the ground beneath the glass and steel. It was a terrifying, executive power, the kind that orchestrated violence from behind a mahogany desk and called it business. But as the first plume of fire licked the horizon, Tae-hyuk's aggressive stance shifted from dominance to desperation. His fist clenched against his side as he watched the unbreakable empire he built on forbidden crimes crumble in broad daylight. For a heartbeat, he wondered if the anonymous whistleblower was the only person left who could see the man behind the businessmen. His eyes, once piercing and cold, now shimmered with an agonizing light, not of fear for his life, but of the desperate relief that comes when a man finally decides to set his own cage on fire. Then, as the first lieutenant's office erupted in a bloom of red and orange, Tae-hyuk didn't run for his security. He took a breath of the smoke-filled air and prepared to burn it all down. If this moment of ultimate testing gives you chills, smash that like button and share this story with someone who believes that true character is revealed when no one is watching. The sky over Seoul was a brilliant, deceptive blue, a vast canopy of silk that Jang Tae-hyuk had come to believe was his personal ceiling. From the 68th floor of the obsidian tower, the world below was reduced to a series of manageable, miniature patterns. He stood on the glass-rimmed balcony, the wind tugging at his navy suit, feeling like a god presiding over a clockwork kingdom. For 20 years, Tae-hyuk had prided himself on his red of the city. To him, the sprawling urban maze was not a place of people, but a map of logistics, flow, and absolute control. He watched the arterial pulse of the morning traffic and saw only efficiency. He looked at the gleaming glass of the financial district and saw only the stability of his own shadow. His life was a curated masterpiece of high-rise luxury, a fortress of marble and silence that smelled of expensive cologne and vintage Bordeaux. He had built this sanctuary to be untouchable, a place where the filth of the streets could never reach. He believed he knew the soul of his empire because he held the ledgers and the loyalty of men who bowed at his feet. He saw a city that was grateful for his iron-fisted order, a place where the Russo-Korean alliance maintained a peace forged in the bold blood oaths he still cherished. On this balcony, he was the architect of a magnificent, lonely cage, convinced that the view from the top was the only truth that mattered. But as the echoes of the midnight call vibrated in his skull, the red he had spent decades perfecting began to curdle like spoiled wine. The smoke rising from the horizon wasn't just a fire, it was a physical manifestation of his own willful blindness. He looked down at the streets he thought he understood and realized he had been watching a stage play while the theater was being rigged with explosives. The silence he had mistaken for peace was actually the bated breath of a coup. The loyalty he had counted on was a mask worn by monsters who had turned his forbidden crimes into a lucrative industry right under his nose. Standing there, the sunlight hitting his face with a sudden, jarring heat, Tae-hyuk realized he wasn't a god at all. He was a man who had traded his eyes for a high-rise view, a leader who had become a ghost in his own palace. The city below didn't belong to him, it was a beast that had outgrown its master, fueled by a rot he had chosen to ignore. As the first distant boom of an explosion reached his ears, the balcony god finally fell, his heart breaking under the weight of a 20-year lie. The smartphone in Tae-hyuk's hand felt like a live coal, pulsing with the heat of the digital ghost on the other end of the line. The voice was distorted, a digital rasp that stripped away gender and age, leaving only the clinical coldness of a death sentence. It didn't start with a greeting or a demand for ransom. It started with a list of coordinates, warehouses in the Incheon docks, sub-basements of luxury hotels, and shipping containers marked with the seal of Tae-hyuk's own logistics firm. The bold oaths you preach to your men are being used as a shroud, Tae-hyuk, the voice whispered, the sound cutting through the distant roar of the first fires. You told them the Russo-Korean alliance stood for the protection of the territory. You forbade the trafficking of flesh. You thought your silence bought purity. Tae-hyuk's breath hitched, a jagged sound that tore through his throat. He looked at the skyline, where a second explosion bloomed like a dark flower, realizing that the smoke was rising from the very locations the voice was naming. These were the sacred hubs of his empire, the places he believed were the backbone of a legitimate, honorable shadow state. While you sat on your balcony reading the clouds, the voice continued, dripping with a lethal irony, your lieutenants were turning those warehouses into cages. They didn't just break your rules, they used your name to guarantee the safety of the monsters you swore to hunt. Minho and the others aren't just taking a cut. They are the architects. They've sold the empire's soul to the highest bidders in the dark, and they've used your old blood rhetoric to keep the rank and file silent. The revelation was a physical blow, more violent than any bullet. Tae-hyuk felt the monolith of his identity fracture. He had been a king of shadows, yes, but he had believed those shadows served a purpose, a twisted kind of order that kept the truly depraved at bay. To hear that his infrastructure, his ships, and his protection were the primary engines for the very child exploitation he found abhorrent was a truth that turned his blood to ice. They aren't just betraying you, Tae-hyuk, the voice said, just before the line went dead. They are becoming you, but without the conscience you pretend to have. If you want to save what's left of your humanity, you have 30 minutes before the city realizes who provided the keys to the kingdom. Tae-hyuk stared at the black screen of his phone, the silence of the room now filled with the phantom screams of those he had inadvertently failed. The voice in the receiver had done more than deliver a warning, it had stripped away the last of his delusions. The empire wasn't being attacked by rivals. It was being purged by its own rot, and as he looked at his clenched fist, he realized that to kill the infection, he would have to burn the host. The high-rise balcony, once a throne of glass and steel, had become a front-row seat to an apocalypse. Tae-hyuk stood motionless, his knuckles white against the railing, watching as the city he thought he had tamed began to bleed fire. The first plume of smoke erupted from the Incheon docks, a black, oily stain that smeared the morning horizon. That was Sector 1, the gateway of his wealth, the very veins through which his commerce flowed. To the world, it was a logistics hub, to the voice on the phone, it was a graveyard of broken oaths. He watched through the shimmering heat as the distant cranes bowed like skeletal giants, consumed by the same machinery of destruction he had spent 20 years perfecting. The second explosion followed moments later, closer and more intimate. A dull, heavy thud vibrated through the soles of his shoes as the Uedo district ignited. Sector 2, his financial heart, the gleaming towers that laundered his reputation and gave his power its legitimacy, was now a vertical furnace. From this height, the shattering of windows looked like a rain of diamond dust, beautiful and horrific. He could almost feel the heat against his face, a searing reminder that the clean money he had prided himself on was as flammable as the filth he had tried to ignore. The skyline, once a testament to his dominance, was now a jagged landscape of shadows and orange light. By the time the third sector began to burn, Tae-hyuk's internal monolith had completely disintegrated. The smoke rising from the Gangnam safe houses, the sanctuary of his old blood lieutenants, was the final, jagged confirmation. This wasn't an accident or a rival's gambit, it was a coordinated strike by the very men he had called family. He saw the black plumes spiraling into the blue sky like funeral shrouds, marking the end of his delusions. His empire was no longer a kingdom, it was a funeral pyre, and he was the ghost left to watch it burn. The bright sunlight felt like an insult, illuminating the sprawling ruin of his life's work with a clinical, unforgiving clarity. Tae-hyuk's mouth was open in a silent shout of agony, his brow furrowed as he realized that the shadows he thought he controlled had finally found their own teeth. The city was no longer his map to read, it was a predator, and the first 3 sectors were merely the opening kill. Standing amidst the drifting ash on his luxury balcony, the Mafia boss realized that he wasn't watching his empire die, he was watching the monster he had created finally come home to find its master. The glass of the balcony door didn't just break, it atomized under the force of a tactical breach, sending a spray of crystalline shards into the plush, ivory carpet of the penthouse. The silence of Tae-hyuk's sanctuary was replaced by the rhythmic, heavy thud of combat boots, a sound he had commissioned and paid for, now turned against him. 4 men in slate-gray tactical gear swarmed through the opening, their movements a choreographed dance of lethal intent. These were his Praetorians, the elite guards he had hand-picked to be his final line of defense. Now, they were the executioners sent to ensure that balcony god never left his gilded cage. Tae-hyuk didn't scramble for cover. The panic that had gripped him moments ago on the balcony had hardened into a cold, crystalline resolve. As the lead guard leveled a suppressed submachine gun, Tae-hyuk moved with a localized violence that defied his age. He wasn't just a businessman in a suit, he was a man forged in the brutal street wars of the 90s, a monolith who had survived by being more immovable than the concrete. He lunged forward, using the heavy mahogany desk as a shield, the wood splintering under a muffled hail of lead. With a roar of primal defiance, he upended the massive desk, the weight of it crushing the lead shooter against the floor-to-ceiling glass. The second guard moved to flank, but Tae-hyuk was already there, his large, scarred hands, the hands Tae-hyuk had once described as tools of truth, closing around the man's throat. He didn't use the finesse of a modern martial artist, he used the raw, crushing strength of a man who had built an empire with his bare knuckles. He drove the guard back into a marble pedestal, the impact echoing through the hollow penthouse like a thunderclap. The air in the room grew heavy and static, the scent of ozone and expensive cologne mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Tae-hyuk felt the monolith within him cracking, but it wasn't from weakness, it was the monster finally breaking free of the executive's skin. He dodged a frantic swipe from a combat knife, the blade slicing through the expensive navy silk of his jacket. In one fluid motion, he disarmed the third attacker, using the man's own momentum to hurl him through the shattered balcony door. As the final guard hesitated, seeing his comrades broken on the ivory carpet, Tae-hyuk stood amidst the ruin of his luxury, his chest heaving and his white shirt stained with the soot of his burning kingdom. He looked at the man, a boy he had once authorized a scholarship for, and saw the same terrifying clarity Renee had seen in Wusung. The penthouse was no longer a palace, it was a cage of his own making, and the only way out was to tear it down with his own hands. He didn't wait for the guard to recover. He stepped over the debris, his gaze fixed on the heavy oak doors of the foyer, ready to descend into the hell he had inadvertently built. Tae-hyuk stepped out of the private elevator lobby and into the emergency stairwell, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind him like the gate of a tomb. The descent began not as a retreat, but as a grueling excavation of his own sins. Each floor he passed was a layer of the monument he had built to his own ego, and each landing held a new set of ghosts. On the 60th floor, the hub of his legal and shell corporations, the air was thick with the smell of scorched paper and ozone. Here, he was met by a swarm of mid-level enforcers, men who had once bowed to his silhouette in the hallways. Now, they lunged at him with the desperation of rats on a sinking ship. He moved through them like a force of gravity, his movements heavy and undeniable. He didn't use the surgical precision of the guards above, he used the environment itself. He slammed a man's head into a brass plaque directory of his holdings, the metal denting under the impact. He used the very luxury he had curated, heavy glass awards, marble statuettes, and solid oak doors, as weapons to break the men who had turned his old blood oaths into a joke. His navy suit was shredded at the shoulders, his white shirt darkened by sweat and the soot of the burning building, but his pace never slackened. He was a man descending into the belly of a beast he had fed for 20 years. By the 45th floor, the headquarters was a vertical war zone. The monolith of his strength was being tested by the sheer volume of betrayal. He felt the sting of a graze on his thigh and the dull ache of a cracked rib, but the physical pain was a distant hum compared to the roaring clarity in his mind. Passing the floor that housed his charitable foundations, he saw the smoke billowing from the ventilation shafts and realized the irony. The fire he had set to his empire was the only thing truly illuminating the rot. Every stairwell was a gauntlet, every corridor a mirror reflecting the face of a man who had traded his soul for a view of the clouds. As he reached the lower executive levels, the opulent carpet gave way to the functional concrete of the building's core. The transition was jarring, a descent from the lie of the high-rise to the hard, unyielding truth of the foundation. He was no longer the balcony god, or the wealthy executive, he was a gladiator in a suit, breathing in the dust of his collapsing legacy. The descent was stripping him bare, layer by layer, until only the man and his rage remained. He kicked open the door to the 32nd floor, his eyes stinging from the haze, ready to face whatever lay between him and the basement where the real evidence of his failure was hidden. The 32nd floor was not an office, it was a vault, a climate-controlled sanctuary of digital servers and physical archives that Tae-hyuk had always regarded as the library of his legacy. But as he kicked open the reinforced door, the air that met him didn't smell of old paper or cool silicon. It smelled of bleach and copper, the sterile, stinging scent of a crime scene that had been scrubbed but never truly cleansed. The lights overhead flickered, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the rows of black filing cabinets that now looked like gravestones. Tae-hyuk moved toward the central terminal, his boots crunching on broken glass. On the main monitors, a series of surveillance feeds were frozen in a digital loop, bypassed by the whistleblower's virus to show the truth that had been hidden behind encrypted firewalls. He saw them then, the faces of the invisible. Grainy footage from the Incheon warehouses showed children being ushered into crates marked with his family's crest. He saw Min-ho, his most trusted lieutenant, shaking hands with traffickers in the very shipping docks Tae-hyuk had visited just a month ago to inspect the fleet. The monolith didn't just crack, it dissolved. Tae-hyuk's hands, stained with the dust of the descent, began to tremble as he pulled open a physical drawer labeled Social Outreach. Inside, there were no records of charity. Instead, he found passports, hundreds of them, stacked like playing cards, each one belonging to a person his empire had consumed. There were ledgers written in a cold, actuarial hand that detailed the price of a human life, balanced against the cost of the fuel for his private jets. The physical proof was a psychic weight that crushed the last of his executive delusions. He had spent 20 years believing he was a necessary evil, a shepherd who kept the wolves at bay. Now, he realized he had simply built a better, more efficient slaughterhouse and handed the keys to the wolves while he watched the sunset from his balcony. The bold oaths were nothing more than a marketing slogan for a syndicate of monsters. A jagged sob escaped his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror that echoed through the hollow room. He looked at the high-end watch on his wrist, a symbol of the time he had wasted building this monument to rot. Any lingering thought of saving the business, of purging the bad actors to keep the machine running, died in that moment. The machine was the problem. The business was the crime. As the smoke from the floors above began to seep through the ceiling vents, Tae-hyuk didn't look for a way to back up the data. He reached for the emergency fire axe on the wall, his gaze fixed on the servers that held the digital soul of his empire. He wasn't there to govern anymore, he was there to execute the legacy itself. The axe swung with a rhythmic, bone-deep thud, each strike against the server racks a desperate prayer for absolution. But Tae-hyuk knew that physical destruction was merely a gesture. To truly excise the cancer, he needed to trigger the master key, a digital failsafe he had designed years ago as a last resort against a total hostile takeover. He moved to the secondary console, his breath coming in ragged, soot-stained gasps. The screen glowed with a predatory red light, demanding a sequence of codes that only he carried in his memory. As his fingers hovered over the keys, he felt the heavy, static tension of the building shifting. Above him, the structure groaned, a monolith of iron and secrets beginning to buckle under the heat of the unfolding coup. He realized then that his lieutenants, in their greed, had already committed treason against his person, but their true crime was the corruption of the bold oaths. Treason against a boss could be paid for in iron, with bullets and blades in a dim alleyway. But the systemic corruption of an entire city's soul, the turning of protection into predation, could only be paid for in fire. Tae-hyuk entered the final string of characters. The master key didn't just delete files, it initiated a scorched earth protocol across his entire network. It would trigger the self-destruct sequences in the offshore accounts, wipe the encryption keys for every warehouse door, and vent the gas lines in the auxiliary buildings. It was a kill switch for an empire, a way to ensure that if he fell, the monstrous machine he had inadvertently built would die with him. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. Activating this meant the end of his wealth, his status, and the very ground he stood on. He looked at the passport of a young girl he had found in the drawer, a ghost he had failed to see from his high-rise balcony. The balcony god was dead, only the man remained. "Burn it all," he whispered, his voice a rasping vow. He pressed the final command. A low, subterranean hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, the sound of the Empire's heart stopping. Digital fire began to race through the fiber-optic veins of the building, mirroring the physical flames consuming the upper floors. He felt a terrifying, quiet power in that moment, the power of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to atone for. The air in the vault grew impossibly hot, the scent of melting plastic and ozone signaling the end of the legend. Tae-hyuk turned away from the terminal, the red light of the screen reflecting in his piercing, weary eyes. He had turned the key, now, he had to survive the furnace. The subterranean hum escalated into a rhythmic, grinding shriek of dying machinery. As the master key protocol saturated the network, Tae-hyuk watched the central terminal's monitors flicker and die, one by one. This was the true setting of the match, not a spark to a fuse, but a digital execution of every asset he had spent a lifetime accumulating. He stood in the center of the vault, a monolith amidst the melting silicon, watching his billions vanish into the ether. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were zeroed out, real estate holdings in London and New York were tied up in irrevocable legal deadlocks, and the complex web of shell companies that formed the empire's skeleton collapsed under the weight of self-inflicted forensic audits. He could feel the machine screaming as it was torn apart. The empire was not just a collection of buildings or men, it was a living, breathing creature of commerce and cruelty, and Tae-hyuk was currently plunging a dagger into its heart. In the distance, the muffled sounds of the building's gas lines venting hissed like 1,000 vipers. This was the price of his awakening. He realized that to truly stop Min-ho and the others, he couldn't just kill them, he had to destroy the incentive for their evil. He was taking away their toys, their power, and their protection, leaving them as exposed as the victims they had exploited. The heat in the evidence room became predatory. The smell of burning plastic thickened, and the red emergency lights began to pulse with a frantic, dying heartbeat. Tae-hyuk's navy suit was now a rag of soot and sweat, but as the financial foundations of his life's work disintegrated, a strange, terrifying lightness began to take hold of him. Every asset deleted was a chain broken. Every warehouse lock he remotely jammed was a step toward a redemption he wasn't sure he deserved. He wasn't just setting a match to his business, he was setting a match to the man he had been for 20 years. The balcony god was being cremated in a furnace of his own making. As the terminal finally sparked and went black, signaling the total meltdown of his internal infrastructure, Tae-hyuk didn't look for an exit. He looked at his hands, large, scarred, and finally occupied with a purpose that wasn't greed. The machine was dead. The empire was cinders. Now, there was only the physical reality of the fire and the long, violent walk to the ground floor. He turned away from the dead screens, the roar of the building's collapse growing louder, ready to meet the chaos he had unleashed. Tae-hyuk burst through the final set of emergency doors, his lungs burning with the intake of cold, morning air that tasted of iron and ash. He emerged not into the orderly, silent world of the corporate elite, but into a street-level purgatory. The lobby of the Obsidian Tower, once a cathedral of hushed voices and polished granite, was now a fractured ruin. Shattered glass crunched beneath his boots like bone, and the bright sunlight he had watched from his balcony now felt like a spotlight on a condemned man. He stood in the center of the plaza, his navy suit shredded and his white shirt a canvas of soot and crimson, a titan who had fallen from the clouds only to land in a hornet's nest. The city was a cacophony of sirens and screams. To his left, the flashing blue and red of police cruisers formed a jagged perimeter, their officers crouching behind doors with weapons leveled at the very building he had just escaped. To his right, dark SUVs, the ironclad chariots of his own organization, were screeching to halts, disgorging men who had once called him father, but now looked at him with the hungry eyes of wolves. The master key had done its work, the bank accounts were frozen, the shipments were seized, and the empire was a hollow shell. Tae-hyuk realized with a terrifying, quiet clarity that he had made himself the most hunted man in the country. He was the fault line between two collapsing worlds. To the police, he was the head of a monstrous snake finally brought to light by the explosions. To the mob, he was the traitor who had burned down their house while they were still inside. He stood in the no-man's land of the plaza, his chest heaving, watching as the two sides began to close in. The distance he had cherished from his 68th floor balcony was gone, the red he had on the city was now a matter of meters and seconds. For a heartbeat, he looked at the smartphone still gripped in his hand, the device that had brought the midnight call, and threw it into the gutter. He was no longer a ghost or a god. He was a man standing in the middle of his own wreckage, realizing that the clean peace he had once imagined was a fantasy. If he was to survive the next hour, he wouldn't do it with a bank account or a title. He would do it as a man who had finally accepted his humanity, even if that humanity was currently a target for every bullet in the city. He took a breath of the smoke-filled air, squared his shoulders like the monolith he was, and began to move toward the shadows of the alleyways, the hunt beginning in earnest. The rain began to fall as Tae-hyuk retreated into the skeletal remains of the tower's ground-floor ballroom, a space once filled with the clinking of crystal and the whispers of high-stakes deals, now a cavern of jagged shadows and hanging wires. He moved through the gloom with a quiet, terrifying focus, his presence still a monolith of iron even as his suit hung in tatters. Behind him, the double doors were kicked open, and the flickering emergency lights caught the glint of drawn steel and the polished barrels of handguns. It was Minho who led them. The lieutenant stepped into the center of the ruined ballroom, his face a mask of predatory greed, flanked by a dozen young foot soldiers who looked more like frightened boys than killers. "You burned it all, Tae-hyuk," Minho hissed, his voice echoing through the hollow hall. "The money, the influence, the legacy. You're just an old man in a dirty suit now." Tae-hyuk stood his ground, his large, scarred hands resting at his sides. He didn't look at the guns leveled at his chest, he looked at the boys holding them. He saw the same, invisible, desperation in their eyes that he had ignored for 20 years, the foot soldiers who were nothing more than fuel for the machine he had just destroyed. "The money was poison, Minho," Tae-hyuk said, his voice lower and steadier than the pounding of his heart. "And the legacy was a lie. I'm not here to save the empire. I'm here to bury the monsters who ran it." As Minho gave the order to fire, Tae-hyuk didn't flee. He lunged, not toward the boys, but toward the man who had corrupted them. The air in the ballroom grew heavy and static as Tae-hyuk used the environment like a weapon, toppling a heavy marble statue of a forgotten king to create a barrier of dust and debris. He moved through the haze, disarming the young soldiers with a blunt, crushing efficiency that spared their lives but broke their resolve. He wasn't killing them, he was setting them free from the old oaths that had bound them to a sinking ship. Finally, he reached Minho. The final confrontation was short and brutal, a collision of concrete and blood. Tae-hyuk didn't use a gun, he used the raw strength of a man seeking atonement. He drove Minho back against the central support pillar, his hands closing around the lieutenant's throat with a weight that suggested he owned the ground beneath them. "You chose the fire, Minho," Tae-hyuk whispered as the overhead gas lines finally ignited, a bloom of orange light reflecting in his piercing eyes. He shoved the traitor into the heart of the spreading flames, turning his back on the corruption he had once fostered. As the foot soldiers fled into the rain, Tae-hyuk stood alone in the burning ruins, the monolith finally at peace as he watched the leaders of his empire vanish into the ash. He had chosen mercy for the innocent, but for the rot, there was only the fire. The rain eventually tapered off, leaving the city air scrubbed clean and smelling of wet stone and rebirth. As the first true light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon, Jang Tae-hyuk walked away from the hollowed-out skeleton of the obsidian tower. He did not look back at the plumes of smoke that were now being thinned by the morning breeze. He walked with a heavy, deliberate stride, his ruined navy suit shed blocks ago, leaving him in a soot-stained dress shirt that felt lighter than any silk he had ever worn. The monolith had finally crumbled, and in its place was a man who no longer needed a balcony to see the world. Standing on a quiet bridge overlooking the Han River, Tae-hyuk watched the sun crest the skyline. The light didn't reveal a kingdom to be ruled, but a community to be served. The destruction of his empire was not an end, but a necessary clearing of the soil. He realized now that true leadership was never about the height of one's tower or the absolute silence of one's subordinates, it was about the accountability of one's soul. He had lived for 20 years in a gilded cage of his own making, mistaking distance for perspective and power for peace. The fire had been a brutal teacher, but its lesson was absolute. An empire built on the exploitation of the invisible is merely a monument to its own eventual collapse. The moral weight of his journey lay in the understanding that, clean success is a myth if one ignores the dirt on the hands of those who build it. Tae-hyuk's story serves as a stark reminder that silence in the face of corruption is a form of complicity, and that the cost of reclaiming one's humanity is often the destruction of one's vanity. He had lost his wealth, his status, and his shadow, but as he watched the city wake up, this time without his thumb upon it, he found a wealth that couldn't be stored in a vault. There is a profound educational value in the ashes of the obsidian tower. It teaches that it is never too late to break the bold oaths, if those oaths have become chains. It proves that real strength is found in the courage to be vulnerable, to admit one's blindness, and to personally dismantle the systems of harm we helped create. As Tae-hyuk disappeared into the morning crowd, unrecognized and unburdened, he carried with him the only legacy that mattered, the knowledge that the monster was dead, and the man was finally, for the first time in his life, home. He had set the empire on fire to save his soul, and in the quiet warmth of the rising sun, he knew it was a fair trade.